Thank you, Torrin. I'm going to read today from 1 John chapter 4. That is not the Gospel of John, but John's little epistle, or his little letter. It's right at the end of the New Testament, right before you get to Revelations. It has a little Roman numeral I in front of it, so we call it 1 John. And chapter 4, and I'm going to start reading with the 7th verse. So I'm just going to read a little passage here in a big chunk, and then we'll stop and make just a couple of points about it. This is 1 John chapter 4, beginning with verse 7. And John writes this: "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God." Verse 8 says, "He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." 9 says, "In this was manifested," or that is to say revealed, "the love of God toward us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. Herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and sent his Son to be the propitiation," that is to say, sacrifice, "for our sins." Verse 11 says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. No man hath seen God at any time. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. Hereby know we that we dwell in him, and he in us, because he hath given us of his Spirit. And we have seen, and do testify, that the Father sent the Son to be the Savior of the world." Verse 15 says, "Whosoever shall confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God dwelleth in him, and he in God." Verse 16 says, "And we have known and believed the love that God hath to us. God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. And he that feareth is not made perfect in love." And then finally, verse 19, "We love him because he first loved us." Now, in this kind of long passage I just read here, there's lots of details and lots of things we could talk about. In fact, we could talk all morning just on what's contained in these verses I just read. But I just wanted to make one observation. John, in these verses we read, is describing, among the other things that he says, he's describing two kinds of relationships, or two kinds of interaction. One is between us and God. The other is between us and those around us. The relationship or the interaction between, and both of those, by the way, John defines by this word love. Our interaction with God, John goes out of his way to emphasize the fact that God himself is the initiator of it. In other words, he is the one who acts first. He says, we love God because he first loved us. So he emphasizes the fact that God is first, or God first loved us. It's not that we got God's attention by, something that we did, but he's emphasizing the fact that God moved first, and that our love for God in this interaction or in this relationship with God is a response, or we're responding to him. He loved us first. That's the point he makes. Now, that's one kind of interaction or one kind of relationship. And really, frankly, that's where we spend most of our time when we come to church and when we read out of the New Testament. Most of the time, that's what we're talking about. This relationship that we have with God, which is defined by his love for us, and other ways of expressing that, like the word grace, which is up behind me on this banner here, by grace through faith. We put most of our emphasis on our interactions and our relationship with God, because honestly, that's the most important one. But notice that John also, in this same passage, talks about our relationship with one another. You could say that our relationship with God is like a vertical relationship, and our relationship with one another is like a horizontal relationship. And you notice that he connected those two together. And he said, if we love God, we ought also to love one another. He emphasizes that as well. In fact, he mentions that a couple of different times, that our relationship with one another is a reflection of our relationship with God. Now let's be plain and let's be honest about it, that and say this up front, that what we do and our actions between one another do not make us Christians. Those do not define our relationship with God. It's just the other way around. God has initiated the whole process and we've responded to Him. And what John is here saying is the way we react or the way we act or the way we interact with one another should be a reflection of our interactions with God, which is defined by love, and that is to say God's love for us. So he's saying as we interact with one another, we should reflect that same kind of love that God has for us. Now, in our modern world, we use words like love, and we mean all kinds of different things, possibly, in many cases, not exactly what John had in mind when he used the word love. For instance, we use love as a kind of a catch-all word which can encompass all kinds of different things. You know, you might say, I love my wife. You might say, I love my dog. You might say, I love pizza. And hopefully you don't love your wife or your dog or your pizza in the same exact way. So we sort of lump it all together. So it's something we need to take into consideration. What does John mean? Or what do New Testament writers mean? And the Apostle Paul actually has a lot to say on this very subject, and is pretty enlightening. Paul and John are right on the same page with this idea. When the Apostle Paul talks about our interactions with one another, he considers that what I would call practical application of Christianity. Paul generally spends the first part of his epistles talking about that vertical relationship, our relationship with God, which, just as John has said, is defined by and established by God and His actions and His love for us, which Paul uses the word grace to describe. God's independent action by which He saved us and sent Jesus to die for our sins and created this thing that we call salvation that we have entered into. We've entered into something that He made. We don't establish it. He established it. So Paul generally talks about that in the first parts of his letters, but then in the second part, he attempts to make a practical application of those truths. In other words, as though he's saying, if you believe what I just said to you about the gospel and about our relationship with God that we've entered into simply by believing in Jesus, if you believe that and you accept that, then here's the way you apply it in your interactions with one another. And very much as John has said. So I just have chosen one of these to read from today to illustrate or to help us see how our interactions with one another, as Paul describes them, are reflections of God's love for us. This is in Ephesians chapter 4, where I'm going to start reading here today. There's lots of interesting things we can observe here. This is Ephesians chapter 4, and I'm going to start reading with verse 21. It's really hard to find a place to start when you're reading from Paul's letters, because every verse starts with therefore, or like this one, if. They're all connected. It's like Paul, I get the impression of a man who had a lot to say, and he just starts going, and it's like one big long run-on sentence, and the person writing it down, I know from what he says in his letters, he used scribes to transcribe or take down what he was saying. I imagine he was like a fire hose, just started out talking and the scribes just scratching away on the manuscript trying to keep up with him. But anyway, I say that to say that verse 21, where I'm starting here, begins with if. And it's connecting onto what he said before, but we've got to find someplace to start. So I'm going to start with that. If so be that you have heard him and have been taught by him as the truth is in Jesus. Now, what he's saying here is, what's real or what's true or what, our basis for believing is found in Jesus, and we're making now application to our lives. Verse 22 says that you put off concerning the former conversation the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. Now, when the King James translation was made that we're reading from here, obviously the text themselves are written in the Greek language. And we're reading in English. We don't read Greek. And so it's a translation. And this translation, sort of the standard translation in King James, was made in 1611. And if you add that up to today, you find out that's 400 plus years old. And as it turns out, the English language has changed somewhat in 400 years. And one word that has changed in its meaning is this word that is used here when it says conversation in verse 22. When we use the word conversation, what we generally mean is when we're talking to one another. In other words, if I call you up on the phone and we talk for a while, we would call that a conversation. Now, that's not what it meant 400 years ago. 400 years ago, this word, and the Greek word that's translated conversation here, is anastrophe, pronounced anastrophe. Anastrophe. It literally means manner of life, or especially the way you live in relation to others. And so you can see how it connects with what we're talking about today. The way you conduct yourself, or the way you live as it relates to others around you. So what he's saying here, and we could just put that in there, that you put off concerning the former way that you live in relation to others, put off the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. You might say, a person might, naturally ask, what does he mean, the old man? In a minute he's going to say the new man. What he means when he says the old man or the old person, he's referring to your identity before Christ, apart from your relationship with Christ. You as an individual, your individual identity without Christ. And he's saying, now that you are in a relationship with Christ, everything is different. I like that song we sang that's based on 2 Corinthians 5:17. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. In other words, you have a new identity. And so what he's saying here is who you would be before Christ in that manner of living, that's something you need to put away or put off, he says. Well, you might also say, how do I do that? Well, he tells you in the next verse, verse 23. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind. So, by the way, that's why we're here this morning. Why do we come to church every week or whenever we do? Well, we're talking about things that hopefully change the way we think, right? That's why I stand up here and read out of the Bible week after week. Hopefully, we're reading things that alter or affect or change the way we think, and that's how the putting off of the old way of living in relation to one another comes about. We hear things that enter into our minds and into our hearts, and hopefully those then are translated into ways of interacting with others. So he says, put off the old man, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Verse 24, that you put on the new man. The new man is your new identity by virtue of your faith in Christ. So he's saying in your thinking, as you think about and consider your identity, the way you think about yourself, it's like put on a new set of clothes. Clothe yourself in a new identity. It's like when Clark Kent takes off his glasses and goes into the phone booth, and now he comes out and he's Superman. He's got a new identity. That's a little bit dramatic. Maybe you don't need to think of it in that kind of a drama, but he's saying consider your identity as something other than what it would have been apart from Christ. Remember, the whole umbrella under which we're thinking here is how you interact with others, your manner of life in relation to others. Put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. After means like. In other words, like God, godlike, created in righteousness and true holiness. When I see that word true holiness, it makes me think, well, if there's a true holiness, there must be a false one somewhere. And as it turns out, yes, there is. We've talked about that quite a bit here. When Jesus had his hostile kind of confrontations with the Pharisees, they had a false holiness or phony holiness, which is all a show. And you still find that kind of thing today. People who put on a show. You don't have to put on a show. There's no show to put on. What he is saying here to put on is, as you interact with others, put on it's who is it? What is the new man? It's really the personality or the nature or the way that Christ is. And if you're wondering, well, what specifically do you mean, Apostle Paul? Well, he's going to tell you that in the next verses. These are the important points of what it means to interact with one another in righteousness and true holiness. So now he's going to tell us. He's going to specify in verse 25. He's trying to be very practical here. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man the truth with his neighbor. You see, that's what I was saying before. We're talking about, the topic is, how do we interact with one another? So first thing he says is, be honest, be open, be sincere. We are members of one another. In other words, consider that we are connected to one another. Just like part of the same family, in other words. Verse 26 says, be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Now this is actually kind of a puzzling verse, and many people puzzle over this. What does he mean? I've heard a lot of different theories. I've heard preachers say a lot of different things. Some completely off the wall things, which I guess I'm not even going to pollute your ears with saying what I consider to be wrong applications of this. What might not be evident, but I'm going to point it out to you, and it wasn't always evident to me, Paul is actually quoting from the Psalms here. He's quoting from Psalm 4:4. Now don't turn to that and read it, because if you do, you're going to find wording that's completely different. The reason Paul, his quotation here is different than what you're going to find if you look in your Old Testament is, Paul is using the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. When Alexander the Great, around about 200 or 300 BC, conquered what we call the Middle East, including Palestine, what is the nation of Israel. When Alexander the Great conquered and then kept conquering and went over into Saudi Arabia and to Persia, and he made it all the way to the borders of India, Iraq and Babylon. He conquered everything in his path. He was a powerful, I don't think Alexander was ever defeated, as far as I know. He wanted to keep going. In his conception, in Alexander's mind, the world was a big flat pancake. He had a flat earth kind of theory. And he wanted to conquer to the edge where the falling off place was. He wanted to see that. And so he could say, I'm ruler of the entire thing. When they got to the borders of India, they realized there's a lot more before we get to that point. And his men and his generals rebelled, and they said, you know what, we would just like to enjoy what we've conquered a little bit. Let's just back up and park where we've been and live it up, That's basically what they said to him in so many words. So they backed up and went back to Babylon, and Alexander the Great began to live it up and drank himself to death is basically what happened. But all that to say, when Alexander conquered all of that region, including the Middle East, he brought with him the Greek culture and the Greek language. And so let's fast forward to the 1st century A.D. By this time, outside of Jerusalem, Jews who were living scattered throughout what was then the Roman Empire did not necessarily have a working knowledge of Hebrew as the language anymore. Now in Jerusalem they did, and they had the Hebrew scriptures. But around about the same time, and you might say in the immediate aftermath of Alexander, The Old Testament scriptures were translated into the language that the Jews in places other than Jerusalem actually spoke and understood, which was the Greek language. They were raised in a Greek environment, in Greek culture, and using the Greek language. And so was the Apostle Paul. If you know anything about the Apostle Paul, you know that he was born in Tarsus. Tarsus is in modern-day Turkey. In fact, it's still there today. It's a city of about 300,000. And you can go there as a tourist and visit. You can actually see things that are labeled with Paul's name. There's a well there, for instance, that supposedly Paul's well, owned by his family. That it's probably not true, but anyway, we know that from the Bible that Paul came from Tarsus. Tarsus was at this time part of the far-flung realms far from Jerusalem, and the Jews of Tarsus did not speak Hebrew fluently, and so Paul was raised with and used in his writings the Septuagint. So all that to say, this little quote here is a quote from the Septuagint, from the Greek translations of the Psalms. And here in this quotation it says, "Be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down upon your wrath." What it actually says in the Septuagint is it says, "Be angry and do not sin, meditate on your own bed," which is not exactly the same thing that says, but what's the thought that's contained there? Well, the thought is, cool down. In other words, the thought is anger is a human emotion, and if it's part of being human. But the thought is just lie down on your bed and cool off and get over it. That's basically what he means by that. And so that long explanation is just to say that is what Paul is saying here. If you get angry, get over it. That's what he's saying, as quick as possible. When it says, "Let not the sun go down upon your wrath," he doesn't mean be angry and never get over it. I've heard preachers, I told you I wasn't going to tell you that, but I've heard preachers actually say that you should never let it go. That's just crazy nonsense. He's saying just the opposite. If you get angry, let it go immediately, as quick as possible. Don't let the sun go down and you're still mad about it. Let it go. It's in your interest and in the interest of everybody else. Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about, as a Christian, as one who is a new person by virtue of your relationship with Christ, how would Christ deal with it? How would he be? How would he interact with other people? Well, what he's saying here is, in a practical way, first thing is, if you get angry, let it go, get over it, resolve it as quickly as possible. Verse 27 says, "Neither give place to the devil." That's a good way to give the devil an inroad in human relationships, is by holding on to anger and letting it metastasize, if that's the right word, and grow. And that can just ruin your life and everybody. It's in your interest, by the way. So he's going on. He's got more to say. Verse 28. These are all just practical things, applying the principle of we're a new identity by virtue of our relationship with Christ, applying that to human relationships. "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands that thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth." You get what the principle here is? If before you encountered Christ, without Christ, before Christ, you were one who stole, well, first thing is, don't steal anymore. But you see what Paul then says is he flips it around. Instead of stealing, taking from someone else, work so that you have something to give to someone else. In other words, he inverts the thing. It's not just to say don't steal, but instead, the way God's love is, reach out, have something that you can give in place of it. Verse 29. "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth." See, he could just stop there and say, don't say bad things. But then he flips that around and says, but instead, that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearers. In other words, instead of things coming out of your mouth that tear people down or make them feel bad or gossip about somebody else, or things that are negative and hurtful, flip it around and see to it that what comes out of your mouth is things that promote well-being and peace. And edifying means building up, that it may minister grace to the hearers. In other words, give them something. I had a friend when we were in Bible school. I don't know if April will remember this. Do you remember Steve Wiley? Do you remember him? He was a drummer in our little worship band and over at Tulsa there. And anyway, he had this practice when he would come across, when we'd meet or when you'd come in contact with him, he would say, "Hey man, you're the best." That's what he'd say. And I knew he was just saying that. But it made you feel good, it's amazing. He'd always say that, "Hey man, you're the best." Well, that's just that's trivial, But you know what? It ministered well-being, And that's just an example. That's a trivial example of what Paul is here saying. So instead of tearing things down, let what comes out of your mouth be something that builds up. Verse 30, "And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you are sealed unto the day of redemption." Verse 31, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger." I'm noticing a theme here. Are you? What he's saying, this thing about anger and hostility, he's basically saying, get it out, let it go. There's no place for that kind of attitude or that kind of personality trait in the life of a Christian. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. These are all words that are interrelated and that are kind of synonymous. They imply a kind of hostility or anger or clamoring and evil. Those are all kind of related words, you see. He says, well, sweep all those away, put all that away. But instead, in verse 32, here's how he turns it around. Instead of that, here's what you do. Be ye kind to one another, tender-hearted. These are the opposites. These are antonyms. These are opposites of what he just said. And listen to this now. Forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Past tense. Now, do you get here that he's saying in your interactions with one another, let them reflect the way God has acted with you? We learned from John's epistle that in this relationship with God, he is the one who, you might say, was proactive, and he loved us first, and he forgave us. Actually, the truth of it is, and I know this makes some people mad, makes some preachers mad, but hopefully they won't hear what I'm saying and call me up on the phone and complain like has happened before. But not only has God been he is proactive in his forgiveness. And truth be told, and I'm going to tell it, he's forgiven you before you even knew that you needed forgiveness. He forgave you before you even knew enough to ask for forgiveness. The forgiveness that God is proactive in giving came about as a result of Christ. You notice that he says, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. What he's saying here is be proactive in your love and forgiveness and being tenderhearted and sympathetic with others around you in the same way that God is with you. Now I'm going to come back to this thought in a minute, but before we run out of time, I want to show you that Jesus taught this exact same thing. And Torrin, this is in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, beginning with verse 38. And I'm going to turn here real quick and I could read it over my shoulder from Torrin, but I'm going to turn and read it myself. This is Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. This is part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. That means he sat up on a little hilltop and people gathered around and he had a lot of things to say. And his whole purpose in teaching in this message on the Sermon on the Mount was to speak to a group of people who were not without knowledge of God. These are Jews. They had the Old Testament. They had a mode of worship. They knew something about God. They had the law. They had the scriptures. But Jesus comes to give a new, you might say, a new spin or a new insight or a new fulfillment, a refinement to their understanding, to a paradigm shift, to see things in a completely new light. And that's what we find here. For instance, in verse 38, He said, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." Now, what he's describing there comes right out of Leviticus. And he said, "You may have heard this before." Well, yeah, no doubt they had heard that before. But you know what he's really describing there? He's describing retribution. He is describing retaliation and retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In other words, you punch my eye, I punch your eye. You knock out my tooth, I'm going to knock out your tooth. He says, you might have heard this before, and they had. But here he has something to refine that idea or add something to it. Verse 39 says, "But I say to you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Now this, like the one we read from the Apostle Paul, is one of those passages that creates a lot of confusion because of the wording. Generally, when we read things that are confusing, it's probably many times, I shouldn't say always, but many times it's due to some kind of a mix-up in the translation. We either don't understand what was being said in the original languages, or sometimes things are lost in translation, or it's quite possible that what's being said is sort of a thought that we hadn't considered. For instance, in this verse 39, when it says, "Resist not evil," that just doesn't set right. But if you read the rest of the verse, let's try to interpret that expression, "resist not evil," in the light of what he says next. "But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him also the other." What he's saying is don't retaliate. In fact, that's what he just said in the previous verse. He said, you might have heard this before, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, if somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn the other and let him, in other words, just take it. In other words, when he says resist not evil, what he means is don't retaliate. Don't give evil for evil. Let me read that to you. No retribution, no retaliation. Let me read that to you from another translation. This is the Contemporary English Version. It says, "But I tell you not to try to get even with a person who has done something to you. When a person slaps your right cheek, turn and let that person slap your other cheek too." In other words, no retribution, no retaliation. And I think by the cheek slapping part, you can see from the context that that's actually what he means. As usual, the Message translation is very pithy and right to the point. Torrin, could you go back to verse 38 and give me the Message translation? Let's just read it, see what it says. Here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Okay? Go on with the next one now. Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. If someone strikes you, stand there and take it. Okay? Let's get the next one. If someone drags you into court and sues you for the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best coat, make a present of it. Let's get the next one. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. Okay, let's get the next one. No more tit for tat stuff. Live generously. Now, what he's getting at here is you need to understand what the nature and the personality of God is really like. This is a reflection of God's method of operation. This is how God is. Let's go back now to the King James translation, and we'll get that point here in just a second. Torrin, I'm going to go back to King James, and we're going to start with verse 41. We're going to get to the point here in a second. This is another one that's very interesting to me. Verse 41 says, "Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain," or that means two. Now, under Roman law at this time, you know that the nation of Israel was dominated by the Roman Empire. They were kept as a province. They were considered a province of Roman Empire. And under Roman law in the first century, imperial officers especially soldiers, had a legal right to commandeer labor or transport from civilians that they encountered in the provinces. In other words, if a Roman soldier encountered you as a Jew living in Israel, and they considered that a Roman province, they could say, "Here, carry my baggage." And they had a right to compel you to carry their gear, but it was limited to 1 mile, but no more. This practice had a name, and it was called angaruo. Angaruo is what it was called. And it was allowed to compel, or as the word is angaruo, to require someone to carry the weapons or the baggage, even a message in some cases, for a mile. Now the Roman mile was about 1,000 paces. That's slightly less than a modern mile. Understandably, the practice was resented by the provincial residents. Now here's a little interesting thought that might not have occurred to you from reading the text. Jesus here says, "Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile." Do you know what the Greek word is that's used here when he says compel, that's translated compel? It's angaruo, the exact name that the Romans used for them, part of their legal code, for compelling people to carry their baggage for a mile. He's using that exact word that they called that practice. So he's pointedly saying to his listeners, and you can understand, they hated this. They hated the Romans for one thing, and they especially hated it when the Roman soldier came along and says, "Okay, you local person, carry my baggage. I've got a right to compel you." So he says if the Roman soldier comes along, or if anyone comes along, compels thee, or angaruo, if they say, "Hey, carry my baggage for a mile," instead, go 2. They only have a right for you to carry it 1. In other words, when the mile is up, say, "Let's go on. I'll carry it another mile for you." Do you see that this is the exact same thing that Paul was describing when he wrote to the Ephesians, when he said, "Don't do," and he'd say this negative thing, but instead turn it around, and instead of saying things that are going to tear people down, say things that will minister grace to the hearers. Or instead of stealing from someone, turn it around and then work with your own hands so you have something to give to people. And Jesus is here saying the same exact thing. See, this is defining for us what God's love is like and how it finds its manifestation, or finds its way of instructing us in how to live in a relation to others as a reflection of God's love. "Whoever will compel thee to go a mile, go with him 2 or 2. Give to him that asketh of thee. And him that would borrow of thee, turn not away." Verse 43, you've heard that it hath been said, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies. You could say, a person might have said, well, what we've just been reading, that's okay within the church. Treat other Christians that way. But here he's saying, no, not just within the church, not just other Christians. Those who you consider to be, whatever you consider to be someone opposed to you, your enemies. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. In other words, when you encounter something negative, turn it around, and instead of retribution, instead of bad for bad, turn it around and give good. Be a channel for... See, this is the nature of God. This is God's personality. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. Pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. Now, he's not saying here that if you do these things, that makes you a Christian. But what he is saying here is, if you are a Christian, this is how you show it. This is how you let it reveal itself in your interactions with others. Now, I said I was going to go back to the Apostle Paul. I want to conclude with my favorite passage on this subject from the Apostle Paul, and it's back torn in Ephesians chapter 4, where we finished chapter 4. We're going to start with chapter 5. Now, Paul didn't say chapter 5. He just kept on with the same thing. And this is, I like this probably best of all. It's so succinct and so clear. So what Paul follows up with, if you can remember what we were talking about a while ago, in chapter 5, which of course for him was not a new chapter, he's just going on with his message. This sums up the idea so clearly. This is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1. First I'm going to read it from the King James translation. It says, "Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children." Now, literally, followers it could be better translated as imitators. Be ye followers or imitators of God as dear children. Verse 2 says, "And walk in love." Now, by the way, just a little bit of information, a little tidbit about the Apostle Paul. When Paul is talking about how we live in relation to other people, he has a favorite word, and that word is walk. Walk, when he uses that word, he means how you live your life one step at a time, one moment at a time, one day at a time, in relation to those around you. And walk in love, and then he gives an example. "As Christ also has loved us, and given himself for us, as an offering and a sacrifice to God, for a sweet-smelling savor." He is using Christ as an example and making the very point that John was also making. The same way that God, through Christ, has established and maintains a relationship with us, characterized by this word love, be a channel of that same kind of attitude let it go toward everyone around you as you interact with others. Now, King James translation here is not bad. I think we get the point. But you know what? The Message translation is so much better. Torrin, could you go back to verse 1? Look at what the Message said. This is so great. I just want to be sure you see this. Is this verse 1? That's verse 1. "Watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents." That's such a good thought, by the way. In other words, look at how God, the best place to see how God behaves? Look at Jesus. Look at Jesus, the way he interacts with people that he encounters. The kind of courtesy and tenderheartedness. All those things Paul was advising. The kind of compassion and did I say sympathy? All those ways that Jesus, that you see him interacting with others. Like for instance, when Jesus said, "Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." And then he says, the first thing you're going to learn about me is I am meek and lowly in heart, meaning I am humble and I'm sympathetic. That's what that means. So here Paul is saying the exact thing. Watch how God deals with us. Look at that, and then you put it into practice. Just like children who learn how to behave or learn how to interact with the world by watching their parents. Now let's get the next verse. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but in order to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. You know what I really like about this translation? I've noticed this with this translator. His name is Eugene H. Peterson, who made the Message translation. He's very astute psychologically, and he in this verse, he reflects the thought that sometimes we do something good for somebody else because in the back of our minds we're hoping it'll boomerang back and we'll get something good from them. But he's saying just sweep all that out of your mind. Don't do good and don't love in order to get something. Don't be manipulative, in other words, but just be freely giving. And you can afford to do that because backing you up, see, you are the recipient of this free, sort of generous love of God in your life. And he's just saying, just be a channel and be a distributor of that same kind of attitude in those that you encounter. Okay, I think that's all we got today. And thank you for being patient listeners, and a person could just go on